This is Addiction Medicine Journal Club. I'm Dr. John Keenan.
And I'm Dr. Sonya del Tredici.
We believe that addiction is a disease that can be treated, and we want to help you stay up to date with the latest research that you can use in your addiction medicine practice.
This is the second part of our crossover episode with Dr. Casey Grover, host of the Addiction Medicine Made Easy podcast. If you want to hear the three of us chat about Kratom and our clinical experiences, you can listen to part 1, titled Kratom, At Least It's Not Fentanyl. This episode is where we cover 3 articles, Journal Club style, about Kratom. It is eligible for Category 1 CME from MyCares, and that CME is free, and the links will be in the show notes. Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Sonya del Tredici, and I am joined by our 2 other addiction doctors, Dr. John Keenan and Dr. Casey Grover. Say hi, guys.
How's it going?
Good evening.
This is another joint episode between the Addiction Medicine Journal Club and the Addiction Medicine Made Easy podcast. If you listened to our first joint episode on Kratom, you heard us with some informal chit-chat about our personal experiences treating patients with Kratom use disorder and what we had learned, just kind of getting our first glimpse of this substance and what it is doing to and doing for our patients. So tonight we are back again to discuss some of the literature about Kratom use disorder and Kratom use in general. And so we're going to have a journal club tonight, a little different from our typical journal club format. Those of you who listen to the Addiction Medicine Journal Club podcast, we're going to discuss 3 articles briefly in less detail than we normally do, but we wanted to get through all 3 so that our listeners could really have a sense of what's out there about Kratom. So with that said, Casey, you want to take it away?
Yeah. So once again, so excited to be podcasting with you guys. This has been super fun, and I've really enjoyed it. So I think we're hopefully going to do some more topics in the future. So just to level set, Kratom refers to a tree-like herb that grows naturally in the southeastern Asia-Pacific region, and the scientific name is Mitragyna speciosa. It has both stimulant and opioid-like properties, and there are multiple traditional medical uses for Kratom, including pain relief and to stave off fatigue. It has also been used recreationally for euphoric effects, and more recently, it has been used to manage opioid dependence and withdrawal. Kratom affects multiple receptors in the body. It's an agonist at the mu and kappa opioid receptors, and there's also some evidence that it inhibits the cyclooxygenase 2 enzyme to produce an anti-inflammatory effect. So, and I forgot one thing, it also does have alpha-2 agonist effects. So the way I think of it, it's a combination of opioids, stimulants, clonidine, and ibuprofen. And I actually came up with a brand name if we want to brand this thing. I think it would be methoxyclonoprophen. What do you think? Right? Because it's got methamphetamine, oxycodone, clonidine, and ibuprofen. Okay. I thought it was funny. You guys don't have to laugh.
We were just talking
we
about...
need a trade name.
A trade name.
I know. We were just talking about swag, and this might have more marketability than the t-shirts.
So with that, we'll go into the first article, and so I get to present the first one, and I'm going to be presenting a paper that looks at why do people use Kratom. And John and Sonya, if I present differently than you normally do, please feel free to add any details that I missed over. It's a very data-dense paper. I think that's why you guys gave it to me. Okay, so the paper...
I'm sure you'll... Wait, I just have to interrupt because I will say that John and I both got articles that were very short and were kind of like almost like research letters, just a few tables. And then the article that Casey chose is like 25 pages long.
Yeah,
oh, Jesus.
So, yeah, we're sorry.
It was very dense. The tables were enormous. So I'll do my best to keep it high level.
Lots of data.
Yeah, lots of data. The paper is entitled Kratom as More Than a Self-Treatment. Kirsten Smith is the first author, and it was published in the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse in 2022. And I always like the introduction to the paper because they kind of give you some backstory. So the authors note that in the United States, Kratom use has been expanding, and some of the reasons that people cite when they say why they use Kratom is basically the self-treatment of various symptoms and conditions, chronic pain, fatigue, anxiety, and depression, for example. And some people also use it to self-manage their addictions, or others just want to have more energy and a better mood. And the authors note that the data that we have on why people use Kratom is very limited because they're just looking at the reasons why people state they use without kind of putting it in the greater context of the person's health and experience. And said another way, previous studies have really stopped at why do you use, whereas these authors wanted to dig deeper. And that's a great segue into the methods of the paper. The study was done in the spring of 2021 as a part of a bigger study on substance use in general. And the authors contacted people who use Kratom by recruiting them through a platform for research crowdsourcing. And I had not heard of this before, called Amazon Mechanical Turk. I hadn't heard of that. And people were included if they were over 18, lived in the United States, and had used Kratom at least once. They got a final sample size of 129 people. And just in case anyone wants to participate in an experiment like this in the future, the participants were paid $7.25. I thought that was kind of a low amount to pay people for a research study.
Yeah, I think though on Mechanical Turk that's kind of high because a lot of what you do there pays like 5 cents or $1. I think we did some paper, I forget what, John, that was done on Mechanical Turk as well. So
Yeah, I remember.
$7.25 is pretty good for that.
Inflation.
Yeah. So, and to the author's point of wanting to dig deeper, they looked at a lot of aspects of the Kratom use. Where did people buy it? Why did they buy it? What did they think about it? Were they open about their use of Kratom? And then how did their use of Kratom affect their experiences in the healthcare system? And so it's a very simple methodology. It's basically just a survey, and it was relatively detailed. Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward paper. So we'll go on to the results, and there are a lot of results. So I'll try to keep it high level and avoid it getting too numbery, if that's even a word. So first, let's look at who was in the study. So it was a little over 50% were female, and about 3/4 were white. The average age of the participants was 35. 40% were at an income that was above the U.S. median, so predominantly lower income. And then only 26% said they were in recovery from an addiction, but it didn't really specify what addiction. And then they started with the first question was, where do you buy your Kratom? Interestingly, most people started using it, about 3/4 started using it after 2015, and most people bought it from multiple sources. The vast majority bought Kratom at smoke shops or vape shops. About 1/4 bought it from gas stations. I always find it interesting when we sell potentially, coordination impairing substances at gas stations like beer and Kratom, but that is what it is. And then 30% went to like an herbal shop to buy their Kratom. Next, the authors looked at why do people use Kratom? And I thought the authors were super clever here. The number one reason for use, endorsed by about 70% of the respondents, was, and I quote, just to feel less crappy in general and improve my quality of life. That's pretty honest, right? And that was the number one reason why people used Kratom. I thought that was a very insightful question. The next most common reason to use Kratom was the treatment of anxiety. And just below that, low energy. About half of respondents said that's why they used it. Just below that was pain relief. About half of the users said they used it to relieve pain. And then on down the list, depression, boosting energy, treating social anxiety, and treating depression and chronic pain. And about 1/3 actually chose to use it because they thought it was safer than other substances. That goes back to your podcast episode, Kratom, at least it's not fentanyl, right? It's safer than other substances. A pretty low percentage, about 15%, they use to treat opioid addiction, and a little more, 18%, said they used to treat alcohol addiction, which I thought was interesting, and a very small amount, less than 10%, used it to self-treat stimulant addiction. So I thought it was interesting that there were multiple different addictions that people tried to treat with Kratom. I was only aware of people using it for opioids. The next thing the authors looked at was, what do people mix with Kratom if they're using Kratom? In other words, how much do we see comorbid substance use with Kratom? And they did a really extensive list. If you look at table 3, there were like 25 different substances from alcohol all the way down to testosterone. And 100% of Kratom users also used alcohol. Not quite sure where to file that, whether that's accessibility, there's some sort of mix between them. 95% used tobacco, and 93% used cannabis. So a lot of people are mixing Kratom with legal substances. About 80% used prescription opioids, and just kind of across the board, there's a high rate at which people mix Kratom and other substances that we would consider potentially addictive. I won't go through the whole list because it's just too long, but table 3 of the article is great. The next question the authors looked at was, well, how often do people actually use Kratom? It turned out that 2/3 had used Kratom in the last year and half had used in the last month. So it wasn't really a sample of a lot of regular users, but it seems like there was a significant percentage of I've used in the past or intermittent users. The next item that they looked at was how do people conceptualize Kratom? This was very interesting. 2/3 thought it should be legal, and 2/3 also thought of it as therapeutic. So that goes back to some of the kind of more societal issues around it that we discussed in the last episode. Only about a quarter thought it was addictive, which is surprising. Maybe it's because they're only using it intermittently. And then only 14% described it as an opioid, which I think we thoroughly investigated in the last podcast. And only 5% thought it should be illegal. So the vast majority of people had a pretty positive a pretty positive perception of it. The next thing they looked at was openness about Kratom. About half of people who used it said that they were open about their Kratom use, but they didn't really specify, is that like friends, family, your bus driver, your pastor? They just said you were open about it. And then lastly, I thought this was really interesting. How did people using Kratom experience healthcare? About a third of patients who used Kratom said they felt stigmatized for using it when they went to an ER or urgent care. And I kind of expected that. And Go Addiction Medicine, only 8% of patients who use Kratom felt stigmatized when they were seeing an addiction provider. So addiction medicine was what's much better about not having people feel stigmatized. About half of the people in this study said that they struggled getting their needs met by the U.S. healthcare system, which is what pushed them to Kratom. And the biggest unmet need was pain. Mental health symptoms were pretty close behind. So that was a whirlwind tour through the data. John and Sonya, any call outs that you want to make or any points that you thought I missed?
Well, it's nothing that you missed, but I just thought it was kind of cool because the paper I'm going to present about what is Kratom use disorder shares two of the authors with this paper. And if you look at the questions they asked, there's definitely some overlap in the surveys because mine is a survey paper also, but the numbers are very different. And so I always think about who's in the study. And these are people, and correct me if I'm wrong, not sure I understand. Are these people who are currently using Kratom or just people who have used Kratom in the past?
It's a single use once at any point in your life.
Right. Okay. So that's the difference because my paper is going to be people who are currently actively using Kratom. So the numbers end up being a little different. So these are people who've used it at least once, which it doesn't necessarily lead to bias, but I think with any of these survey studies, who's going to use Kratom? You know, it's one of these products that like some groups, everybody knows about it and other groups, nobody knows about it. You know, like I asked a bunch of people I know, like my friends, and I was trying to find a botanist who could talk to me about Kratom. No one had even heard of it, you know, and then here it is for sale at like all these tobacco huts. So I'm sure people who frequent tobacco huts have heard of it. So it's like, it's not a random sample of the population, people who have, you know, who know about and use Kratom. So I just think that's not a good or bad about the study, but I always think about who's the underlying population in one of these surveys.
Yeah, I think it was really good the way you kind of pulled out those call outs from all those tables. There's a lot of data. I think, kind of key takeaways I took away from that you kind of highlighted. I thought it was very interesting, kind of the comorbid, kind of other substance use, kind of all kind of legal or kind of within our kind of legal constraints. Also kind of the high association with the kind of patients seeking pain relief, kind of reflection of our really kind of lack of options in that domain still. And the fact that they were felt that like they were kind of failed. So they were like, it's almost like they were reaching here in kind of this kind of confines of our current operational system, trying to get some outcome that they weren't receiving. So interesting points.
Yeah, I'm going to move on to the discussion section. So the authors had a really long discussion. Once again, I think that's why you guys gave me this paper. So I'm going to make just a couple of key points that I pulled out of the discussion section. So first, there are many reasons why people use Kratom. And one of the points that the authors made that I liked was they feel like Kratom, when they asked people, Kratom is a pragmatic way to deal with the unpleasant feelings that get in the way of normal life. Whether it's anxiety, depression, pain, low energy, people are just practical trying to feel better. And I think that's a lot of what we deal with in addiction medicine in general. They also noted that kratom was perceived as safer than other substances, which brought people to it because they felt like it was less likely to be either addictive or cause an overdose or cause harm. And then maybe because it's sold as a supplement, that it is poorly labeled. So that's a whole separate issue. And as I mentioned, the poor labeling, the potential for addiction or dependence is really underappreciated, particularly when you go into the store and there's really just no mention of it at all. Um, the authors also dug into how kratom compares to other substances. In other words, how much do people like kratom versus other substances? And what they found is that 50% of respondents rated, compared to other substances, kratom as one of their most favorite substances to use. So I thought that was interesting. So they really kind of tried to tease out, like, do you like cannabis? Do you like alcohol? Kratom was often in people's top number of substances. And so I think there certainly is an amount of euphoria that we need to consider as well, just because people rate it so highly compared to other substances. And then the authors describe their limitations. And the main one they call out is that they did not ask patients if they use kratom to manage kratom withdrawal as opposed to opioid withdrawal. So that would have been a nice piece to find out if people are self-identifying that they are dependent on kratom and have to use to stay well. And then they wrap up the article with a moving forward section. They basically kind of put it all together and say, given the complex reasons why people use kratom, healthcare providers should really focus on asking open-ended questions. Why do you use? What unmet medical needs do you have? And then also be willing to address those unmet medical needs, whether it's pain, insomnia, anxiety, whatever. And then also healthcare providers need to get informed so they can educate patients on kratom. So thus we're doing the podcast.
Whew, that's a whirlwind.
Yeah, it was fun. I learned a lot.
Yeah. So can I ask you guys a question that is sort of related to your article, Casey? And I was going to talk about it with my article, but I feel like it fits in right here, which is why people use kratom. And this generated a lot of discussion in our live journal club we did with our colleagues last week. There's a huge overlap between people who use kratom. In my article, they're using kratom currently, and people who have other substance use disorders. So I think it was, in my study, 75% of people in the sample of people who use kratom have a history of a substance use disorder. And of people who were diagnosed with kratom use disorder, very high percentage had either active opioid or alcohol withdrawal disorder. But basically 75% of people who use kratom have received treatment for a substance use disorder. There's just a huge overlap. And I wonder what you thought of that. Do you think does that surprise you? Does that not surprise you?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. So, people always ask me, is there such thing as a gateway drug? And my answer is always, people who use substances, if you hang out with them, they're going to be using substances and they may offer you one and you may be inclined to take one. And then when you're using a substance, it inhibits your executive function. You may make a decision that you wouldn't otherwise make. Like, sure, I'll smoke some cannabis after 3 beers. So I've never been in a smoke shop in my life, right? And we know that there's very high rates of tobacco use and people use other drug paraphernalia like bongs that are sold in smoke shops. So I feel like people that are already in that world are going to be exposed to it, whereas I had never had a reason to walk into a smoke shop. So I feel like it's more that they're sold where they are as opposed to that people are gravitating to it for another reason. I think the other thing we have to consider, and I haven't done this and I'm afraid to, but if you go on kind of the message boards online, there used to be a message board called Opiophile. I don't know if it's still around, but it was a message board where people would just talk about their opiates. How do you get the doctor to give you Dilaudid, et cetera? So there's probably a lot of kind of in the darker corners of the internet, a lot of discussion about this that kind of perpetuates use. And again, if you're asking for help with opiates or pain or whatever, and someone says, have you tried this? Have you tried this? What about kratom? I think that's probably, again, it's that kind of the company you keep that leads people to this. And again, that bias being towards the company you keep being people with substance use disorders and who use substances.
Right. That's an interesting thought. Yeah, those forums are not so dark if you spend any time on Reddit. I have not gone to r/kratom, but I bet it's pretty good. Yeah, we were just thinking about it. We also wondered about, people who do have a history of substance use disorder, if there's a sort of continuing desire to alter your consciousness and a continuing seeking, like you said at the beginning of your article, people who just want to feel different want something to take to cope with discomfort, mental and physical, of daily life. And I feel like that's a characteristic of people with substance use disorder. And I don't know if they had that characteristic before they developed substance use disorder, or it's because of the substance use disorder they've lost their capacity to tolerate discomfort. But to me, that sort of that fact drew me in, that maybe that's why there's that overlap too. That's a group of people seeking something to help with discomfort.
Yeah, the other addiction doctor in the practice, the lovely Dr. Reb Close, who happens to be my spouse, the way she describes it is feel something, take something.
Mm-hmm. Well, right, and that maybe would drive people to look towards Kratom for help with anything. All right, are we ready for the second article?
Let's do it.
All right, so this article is about the diagnosis of Kratom use disorder, which of course is not in the DSM-5, but maybe someday will be. So it's called The Prevalence of Kratom Use Disorder Among Kratom Consumers, and it shares several authors with the other paper, and it was published in Addiction Medicine in 2024. So, as Casey said earlier, the kratom alkaloids act on a whole bunch of receptors in the brain, the adrenergic, noradrenergic, serotonergic, opioid receptors. So they have clinical effects similar to both stimulants and opioids, and many consumers report significant benefits. But as use increases in our population, and the general, data says anywhere between about 1% to 6% of our population is currently using kratom, there's a certain subset of patients who find that their use has become uncontrollable, and they develop what we would view as a substance use disorder. So the question asked in this article is, could uncontrollable kratom use meet the DSM-4 or DSM-5 criteria for substance use disorder? And what is the prevalence of kratom use disorder as defined by these DSM criteria among current kratom consumers? So is it the same as opioid use disorder, or is there something different about it? So the clinical question here, this was a survey study, 2,061 people, and they completed an online anonymous survey. They were recruited specifically from online communities that dealt with kratom, both pro and anti kratom communities. They tried to get both sides, but of course, if you're currently using kratom, you probably are a little more on the pro side than the anti side. In terms of inclusion, you just had to be an adult over 18 and currently consuming kratom. People in the study were about 52% male. The mean age was 47, mostly Americans, mostly in the American South. You were only excluded if you didn't complete the survey correctly. And the outcome was kratom consumption patterns, adverse effects, comorbidities, and then the components of the DSM criteria for substance use disorder. Did you meet them? And this was done recently in, February to May of 2023. So this is newish data within, about 2 years old. I thought it was a really good study. So basically just a survey, anonymous, online. They did a good job with the data. Some strengths is that they recruited from a variety of online communities. They tried to get people who were not just all super pro kratom and only had good experiences. It's a unique data set. And what I mean by that is this is an emerging issue with very little data. So this is a really unique paper. And they did use these previously validated criteria for substance use disorder, i.e. the criteria from the DSM, to define kratom use disorder. There were some serious limitations, though. First off, it's an anonymous survey. There's no objective data. There's no guarantee of truthfulness of any of the answers. There's also serious selection bias. So I think most people who would be recruited to this study might have a favorable attitude towards kratom. You're participating in some kind of online kratom-related group. You're taking kratom currently. You're engaged with the product. A lot of people who had adverse effects would not maybe no longer be using because they experienced adverse effects. And then the other limitation, and you guys let me know what you think, you can meet the DSM criteria for substance use disorder with just tolerance and withdrawal. And the only exception being is if you're under a prescriber's supervision, like with prescribed opioids or many prescribed medications where you get tolerance and withdrawal over time. But if it's a substance that's not prescribed, just tolerance and withdrawal itself is enough to meet criteria for substance use disorder. But patients may not perceive tolerance and withdrawal as a problem. Think of yourself and your own caffeine consumption. Like, I have tolerance and withdrawal to caffeine. I don't really view that as a problem. or a disorder. It's just tolerance and withdrawal. And most people are pretty comfortable with that as a, pharmacologic effect without feeling like it's a problem. So many of the people with kratom use disorder are actually not experiencing harm, even though experiencing harm is the true hallmark of a substance use disorder. So to me, that's a limitation of trying to define a substance use disorder with this compound that for most consumers seems relatively safe. So before we talk about the results, any thoughts on this paper overall or how they structured it?
Yeah, I think the one point I would make about your point about tolerance and withdrawal, the reason that's excluded for under the care of a provider is because you're getting it regularly for a medical need, right? So in order to develop tolerance and withdrawal, you have to take a substance regularly, meaning these are people that are not able to self-regulate their kratom use enough to not develop tolerance and withdrawal. Same thing for you and caffeine. You can't regulate your caffeine intake well enough to avoid the dependence and withdrawal. So I think the reason it's in there is it just represents the level of use spontaneously, which represents that these are relatively heavy users. So I think that would qualify as a mild disorder. If you use it enough that you get sick when you stop, you probably need to cut down.
Maybe,
Well,
or maybe not.
Your caffeine excluded, of course.
Of course, don't touch the coffee. But a lot of these criteria for substance use disorder are sort of self-referential and to me are a little bit circular. So we'll talk about who met what criteria, and then we can see if we really think they're experiencing harm. So results. I'm going to skip over what I was going to talk about, which is people's reasons for using kratom is relatively similar to the study that Casey presented, mostly to self-treat pain in this group, chronic pain management, just to feel less crappy. Like you said, that was another one of the same authors, same question, about 51%. It's safe, gives you energy, treats anxiety, depression, social anxiety, sleepiness. About 26% of people were using it as a substitute for opioids, which I thought was interesting in this survey. And so that was interesting, but mostly the same reasons you have presented in your paper, Casey. Very few people were doing it just for fun. So for recreation or fun was only 14%. Most people were treating a specific negative thing that they wanted to go away. So then the big results are whether or not the respondents are experiencing the DSM-5 symptoms of kratom use disorder. So they divided the data up into looking at the full sample and then those with kratom use disorder and without kratom use disorder. The majority of the symptoms have to do with tolerance, withdrawal, and uncontrolled use. But other than that, very few people experience the actual adverse effects from the kratom itself. The most common symptom of harm was about 5% of respondents said they continued to use it despite causing physical or psychological problems. But, if you look at the full sample, about 31% of people experience tolerance, 21% experience withdrawal. So 1 in 5, chronic users do have withdrawal, which isn't terrible. About 16% experienced cravings, 14% experienced increased use. And to me, these are kind of circular. Like cravings, I know they're not the same as withdrawal, but like the cravings go with withdrawal, the increased use goes with the tolerance. About 9% experienced inability to cut down, again, going with withdrawal and cravings. So I feel those are all kind of circular. And then you get to what I said, like the continuing to use despite it causing medical problems. And that's about 5% of consumers. A small percentage of people continue to use despite social problems. About 3% of people spent a lot of time trying to obtain, use, and recover from use. About 1.7% said it contributed to failure to fulfill their obligations. So those more harmful ones, 5% and down. So if you look at the people who actually met criteria for kratom use disorder, again, the majority were tolerance, 81%, withdrawal, 68%, cravings, 57%, increased use, 53%. So just all of this stuff with the escalating use. If you get to harm, that was about, the highest was about 20% of people continued to use despite it causing medical problems in the people who actually had kratom use disorder. And if you look at the actual prevalence of the kratom use disorder, of the people who had the kratom use disorder, about 66% was mild, 20% was moderate, and only 13.9% was severe. So what do you guys think of that result in terms of who has what with kratom use disorder?
You know what I kind of thought about after we presented this at the Live Journal Club? I had my clinic afterwards, and honestly, if you were to sub out kratom with buprenorphine, literally almost this entire paper would describe any day in my clinic. We talk about kind of like opioid use disorder treatment, kind of what are we targeting? We're targeting those, like, the criteria for diagnosis. Like, do they have kind of familial issues? Do they have issues with kind of legal problems? Do they have issues kind of with functionality? But, this article for like why they use kratom, that's actually kind of the exact same reasons where the majority of my patients come to me for buprenorphine. They basically, they want to feel better. They feel kind of run down, cruddy. They lack energy. They don't kind of self-report to me that they feel that they're at risk of not having a job or that they want to repair necessarily all of them kind of a relationship in their life. And then even when you look at kind of what we're calling kratom use disorder symptoms like tolerance, withdrawal, cravings, those are all very common with overlap with patients that I kind of see in the clinic. It's kind of interesting how it kind of the analogy between the two, it's very similar.
Well, and I think it can be similar because they're both legal. It doesn't destroy your life or throw your life into chaos. So most of the really bad effects of drugs, not most, but many, have to do with it being illegal. And if it's legal and the supply is relatively safe, although kratom is unlabeled and unregulated, so who knows how safe it is, you don't have as many of those other health problems related to it. But yeah, you're right. It's kind of like a low-level opioid.
Yeah, I think my take home was that, if tolerance and withdrawal are the main issues, the package should say so, meaning that this goes back to greater a need for better labeling. And when I met with some of the folks in the kratom industry, that was something that I felt like they said they wanted to be a part of. Now, granted, and I joke, probably a bad joke given the politics in America right now, but there's the kratom right and the kratom left. The kratom right is that kratom's evil, and the kratom left is kratom for all. And so I feel like, depending where you are on that spectrum, from what I heard from the folks in the kratom industry, it shapes what you think should be on the label, which is probably why there hasn't been better labeling yet, because people can't necessarily agree what should be on it. But I think what I took away is, again, if tolerance and withdrawal are the main issues, then that's something that I need my patients to know about. That, hey, if you use it regularly, like oxycodone, it's going to be something that you're going to be dealing with withdrawal if you want to stop it.
Well, right. And if you're counseling your patients, you could tell them about 24% of habitual consumers will develop kratom use disorder. And most of it, again, is tolerance, withdrawal, cravings, using more than you meant to. But still, 1 in 4 of habitual users are struggling with too much use, probably. So I think I will also counsel people to look out for this escalating use. There are, if you're in the kratom, for people who use kratom regularly, there is some promotion of taking holidays, not taking it every day, watching out for escalating use, that kind of thing, to avoid that tolerance. But if people do develop kratom use disorder, only about 14% was it severe, which is about 3.5% of the total habitual users, but still a fairly large number of people in our country, given how common kratom use is. So that's my takeaway. I was really glad I read this paper because there's a lot of like, what is this stuff and how bad is it for you, really? So I would say the risk of kratom use disorder is very high, 1 in 4 habitual consumers. And people should definitely be aware of it. And the problem is, once you put that on the label, it's like, well, wait, we're selling something that 1 in 4 people will develop a use disorder for, you know? So once you put on the label, you're acknowledging that we have a problem.
It's surprising how high the kind of the rate of kind of the severe criteria is to me. That's kind of much higher than I was expecting. I don't know if you felt the way. I just was something that I'd be honest with you. I ask my patients about this now. I have a couple people, but I'm not hearing it like nonstop like many other substances. I'm surprised though that it kind of affected a subgroup that much at that percentage.
Yeah, I don't know if I had any expectation at all. To me, I just don't know, because I also feel like this is a subset of the population predisposed to have a positive effect. So actually, I think the true number is probably higher than in
Yeah,
this study. All right, you ready for our
interesting.
last article, John? You're gonna close it out with treatment of kratom use disorder.
Yeah, and actually, after Casey presented, I actually feel kind of bad now because this was actually like a pretty sweet article for me to review.
It was it was really
It was
easy
like
to
it was like 4
understand.
pages, read very like easy. I actually kind of read it. I was like, "Oh, that was like a little article to read while I was like laying on the couch." And Casey's over there on the heavy bag, so I feel a little bad. So this is a long-term buprenorphine treatment for kratom use disorder. It's a case series from the Substance Abuse Journal from February 2022. A little bit of background, just kind of abridged after we already talked about this introduction. But we talked about kind of this kind of multi-mechanism of action, and certainly a lot of kind of the concern regarding kratom use and kratom use disorder possibility is related to kind of the effects of kratom on the mu opioid receptor. It seems kind of a little bit less likely off of the cyclooxygenase or the amphetamine like stimulant effect. So therefore, because of that, it seems like the mu opioid receptor is probably a great target for treatment. And so that's why there's a thought that can we use at least buprenorphine to treat this? Anecdotally, prior to the start of this kind of case series, they talked about that there has been kind of case reports kind of previously published about buprenorphine being used successfully. So in this clinic, they basically want to do a follow-up seeing, is this something that they can use on a more large scale than one or two cases? They did a case series. The clinical question is pretty straightforward and very relevant. It's can buprenorphine, here was the combination formulation, be an effective treatment for patients with kratom use disorder? It's a case series study, so 28 adult patients, and they actually self-identified that their primary substance use disorder was kratom use disorder. So it's a self-identified substance use disorder by the patients at 28 clinics. And it was basically evaluating the effect of treatment with buprenorphine on both retention, but also kind of what dose was required for capture and kind of how patients felt in terms of comfort level as they progressed through treatment at these clinics. The patients were all adults. They were age 18 and above. It was 28 patients. Most of these were recruited from the Pacific Northwest, West, kind of Alaska, Washington, Montana, North Dakota region, with the vast majority being from Washington state. They basically had this archived data from their clinic. I really love the fact that the authors that did this was basically just kind of their clinic's data on them using this. So there was like no real industry funding bias. They just kind of wanted to report a larger amount of results of how they were treating this in their clinic. The big variables that they analyzed were past duration of kratom use. They did average daily dose of kratom. They did buprenorphine induction and stabilization doses. And they did urine drug testing results at week 0, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12 consistently. There was other ones in between, but those are the ones they analyzed versus each other. They did look at other things like duration of treatment and current clinic treatment status. But the big ones were kind of the UDT results, kind of dosage, and kind of retention to care. Yeah, not unlike probably what the majority of us do in clinical practice, this treatment involved a home induction. The home induction instructed patients with kratom use disorder to not use kratom or any kind of opioids, benzodiazepines, alcohol, or sedatives within 24 hours, and then do a home induction. It was, relatively what you would expect, kind of a daily home induction. The only difference here was they did a once daily dose, and I think kind of many of us kind of gravitate towards the split dosing anecdotally. And if the patients still were having kind of withdrawal symptoms, weren't comfortable, they would follow them up 1 to 3 days after that initiation home induction. And then anyone that was kind of comfortable, they saw them a week later. So relatively close follow up, a week and then 1 to 4 days if they were kind of struggling. The statistical analysis was pretty basic. It's kind of just basically descriptive statistics of those variables of interest. The only kind of one fancy statistics they did was a Pearson's correlation coefficient. And they basically were looking at kind of how much kratom use people were doing at baseline and did that correlate whatsoever to their stabilizing dose for buprenorphine. Any thoughts on what they did here or what they were looking at?
No, but it's just real nice to see someone publish a paper that's just from their clinic and their patients, because I think we're all doing interesting stuff. But it's big enough, like 28 patients. It's not a single patient or 2 patients or 3 patients. I think it's big enough to draw some good conclusions about.
Yeah, God love them. The authors reported a conflict of interest of that they were received a salary from their job at this clinic. Like that was a conflict of interest. I was, I was like, how wholesome is that, right? So, is the trial valid? It's a case series, so you have to take that with what that is. This is a non-industry funded case series from a clinic, a bunch of people in the field that treat this, kind of giving us their results for a relatively large case series of patients they were treating. Relatively narrow age group, 24 to 53, so not kind of generalizable to your adolescents or kind of your kind of geriatric patients with substance use disorder. Um, and these patients also self-identify kratom as their primary substance use disorder. I think we've talked about this many times, Sonya, you and me. Eh, I always find interesting, like when you kind of look at like factually, a patient writes down like what issues they've had with what substances over their life and which one they identify as their primary substance use disorder. And I don't always find that the two correlate, to be quite honest. I feel like sometimes people identify as having this disorder, but really another one is the one that's kind of driving the chaos and legal complications. So, I mean, it's important, but that may not have been their primary disorder, especially as we've talked about with a lot of our other kind of data about kratom, that most of these patients have other substance use disorders or transitioning from another substance use disorder. So I would probably argue, not to play devil's advocate, that probably whatever they transition to or from might actually be their true substance use disorder. Um, I don't know.
Right. The kratom is like a way station between opioid use disorder and, say, buprenorphine or something.
Yeah. So, it wasn't blinded. There was no random selection here. This is basically patients that came to this clinic and they were just trying to treat these people. No FDA approved options currently. So they were kind of doing the best they can to kind of work with these people, kind of what I think all of us do every day. The only thing I wish we had from the case here is I wish we had some kind of comorbid conditions. Like I would love to see like which ones were dual diagnosis. It would be nice to know a little bit how they got there. Like, are they treating pain? Anecdotally, I find that kind of chronic pain and substance use disorder treatment's a little different than people that are seeking it more for kind of a euphoric state of mind or chasing something. Just kind of how you kind of approach them is a little different. But overall, it's a really kind of robust study for something that we don't really have a great answer for. So the results, like we talked about, total of 28 patients, age 24 to 53. The average age was 36, kind of very relevant. Clinic locations, Northeast US, most Washington State, that was 12 to 28. The kratom use at baseline kind of ranged quite substantially, anywhere from zero point 0.6 grams to greater than 850 grams per day. So very kind of large dosing variations here between what these patients were on. And it's funny that, duration was anywhere from a month to 25 years. So kind of interestingly that, patients progress to kratom use disorder that quickly. I thought kind of even having people on the 1 month side. And then 25 years is really long. I kind of almost wonder where they were even getting it 25 years ago.
Well, right. Like it certainly wasn't being sold as it is now 25 years ago. I guess if you're, Malaysian and maybe you're using it, from
Eh,
somewhere
Where
else.
where there's a will, there's a way, I guess.
Yeah.
So some information about kind of induction and stabilizing dosage. 4 to 8 milligrams was typically the starting dose, and that was the overwhelming majority. So 16 of 28 patients fell within that starting dose. It's 57%, so just a little over half on our typical 4 to 8. Stabilizing dose, the majority stabilized on 12 to 16 milligrams. So that was 19 out of 28. So it's about 70% of patients stabilized on that dose. And the range was 4 milligrams up to 20 milligrams. So relatively kind of narrow range, pretty representative of what I think we kind of most of us use this medication for opioid use disorder for. In terms of initial induction, 15 of the 28 patients, so the overwhelming majority reported improvement of withdrawal symptoms and cravings after induction by that second appointment. So the induction dose was pretty successful at kind of improving where they started from. Even though there was a large improvement, stabilization took 2 to 3 weeks for the majority of these patients. So people kind of felt their best after kind of 2 to 3 weeks engaged in care in the clinic. Interestingly, the one statistics they did, the Pearson correlation coefficient, there was actually no association whatsoever between kind of baseline kratom use and the buprenorphine treatment target dose. So it's kind of interesting. There was no kind of change there. Something we care about every time we talk about these kind of treatments with buprenorphine. There was 0 cases of precipitated withdrawal with this medication.
That is great to know.
And
Yeah.
that's a whole like another topic we've talked about a bunch of times. Like, what is the true incidence of this phenomenon? But it's good to know here I guess because you're going from a partial to a partial, it probably is pretty safe to start treatment. I wonder if they even looked at kind of like a more in real time induction on any of these patients in the future since then.
Well, it's also just a low, compared to some of the stuff we do, it's a relatively low dose. So, it's just not as potent. And, I don't know about the poor person in this study who was taking 850 grams a day of kratom. That's like almost a kilogram of kratom. That's so much. But a lot of people, probably pretty small dose. So you would hope they wouldn't have precipitated withdrawal.
One would hope.
850 grams a day.
Greater than.
Greater than.
I mean, self-reported again, right? So, sometimes maybe this is a Superman story, but that's what they were reporting they were doing.
Yep. It's a lot.
Patient follow-up. I actually thought this was really kind of great. 71.4% of the patients actually engaged in continued follow-up throughout this case series. So that would kind of, compared to what we do in a lot of addiction medicine, 71% follow-up, that's pretty darn good. So 20 of 28 kind of stayed in treatment. And the 8 that were lost to follow-up, one moved out of town, one tapered off and just self-discharged. So basically that was kind of a successful transition off. And then only 6 were truly lost to follow-up. So kind of even less than that truly were like, kind of like, this isn't for me, I'm out. A duration of treatment and care ranged from 5 to 22 months with an average of 11 months. So pretty good again for addiction medicine. When you look at the urine drug testing results of interest, just shy of 70% of patients had negative results for opioids throughout treatment. So that's pretty good. And then when you look at kind of results for the drug metabolites for the kratom, at week 4, 68% of participants had negative metabolite testing. At week 8 and 12, it was 82%. So even kind of as the treatment went on, there still was some kind of intermittent use for a subset of the patients, but kind of relatively very quickly, there was kind of capture of this and kind of it started to kind of disappear out of the urine drug testing results. 9 out of 28, so that's 32% of the patients, about a third of them actually were either restarted or intermittently used kratom throughout the duration of the follow-up. So, it worked really well, but a third were still kind of dabbling back and forth for one reason or another. They don't really say why. The majority of those were basically reporting occasional use sporadically throughout, not kind of continuous use.
I'd be interested to know, how people, when they are taking buprenorphine and they do use a full opioid like oxycodone, they really don't feel much effect. I kind of would love to ask these people, what did the kratom feel like when you're on the buprenorphine? Do you get just like only the stimulant effect? Or, or what's it feel like? We'll have to, if anybody has any
Great
patients,
question.
you can ask, we'll
That's
ask them.
interesting, yeah. Yeah, I actually have one on. I want to ask because I know they're still dabbling. I want to ask them, I think, next Tuesday. That'd be a
Cool.
good question. Yeah, so kind of, I'll go into what I'll take away from this, but kind of, I've already kind of summarized kind of the key points here. Kind of basically low induction doses were very effective here in the majority of patients, 4 to 8 milligrams. Stabilizing doses, 12 to 16 milligrams in most of these participants or recipients of treatment, which is very similar to what we do for the majority of our buprenorphine patients. Very effective at alleviating withdrawal. Stabilization can take up to a couple of weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. So kind of don't dismay if you're not getting the results you want immediately. I think very similar to our patients with opioid use disorder, buprenorphine stabilization dose does not necessarily correlate to kind of duration or amount of past use. So kind of a big discrepancy between kind of what dose you have to use to kind of keep someone in treatment, what dose treats withdrawal, and what dose actually treats cravings, which, it seems to be a theme in addiction medicine. Most patients, 70+% continued treatment with this, so they were satisfied and continued follow-up. And it was very quick. Within the first month, almost 70% of your patients were no longer testing positive for this substance. And it kind of was effective up to 82% at 12 weeks. So overall, kind of a very interesting case series that kind of gives credence to, I think, a practice a lot of us are already doing, kind of using buprenorphine off-label for treatment of patients with this. I'm not sure what you guys think about those results.
Love them.
It matches my clinical practice. Bupe works great, and I let people self-titrate where they feel most comfortable in terms of cravings and withdrawal. And I'll be starting one of my kratom patients on buprenorphine hopefully next week.
Awesome. Hope it goes well for her or him.
Yeah, this article made me feel better about myself, because I feel like sometimes there's so much of medicine that doesn't fit in the box, right? You have these little boxes like this condition's here, this condition's here, and then but people don't exist in reality inside the boxes, and so you have to kind of like use what you know, kind of tailored to a person. And so I've kind of been doing this at least for the 2 patients I have treated, and it's nice to know that I'm not doing a bad thing and that this actually probably is effective, right? It validates a practice I'm already doing.
Yeah, that's great.
Oh, but I think it's and I was talking to one of my patients about this today. How do we define sobriety, right? One of my patients was like, hey doc, I'm sober. I'm only on cannabis. It's like, well, there's some discussion there. I think if someone's using Kratom and you get them on bupe and they don't withdraw, and they do use Kratom and they're working and they're a family member, like, great. So I don't necessarily know if I felt like I was outside the norm using buprenorphine for Kratom, but thank you for reassuring me that I am inside the norm.
You're in California. Do they call that California sober in California too, or is that just a East Coast thing?
Yeah,
No.
no. I've mentioned it to some of my patients, like, hey, they call this California sober, but we do not
Yeah,
use
I was
that
about to
term.
say, I wonder how they feel about it in California.
It's okay. Well, I was one of the few Californians playing lacrosse in the 90s
Oh
and
wow, yeah,
2000s because it's much more of an East
yeah.
Coast sport. So I'd go to lacrosse like tournaments and camps, and the East Coast players would say, "Let's do the California stretch where you lay on your back in the sun." I was like, "Hey, we don't do that."
Oh my gosh. Well, look, guys, this has been an awesome discussion of 3 interesting articles about Kratom. I'm looking forward to much more research, and I'm interested to hear what our audience's experience have been treating Kratom use disorder. And I also want to remind our listeners that this episode is going to be eligible for CME, and we'll put the links in the show notes, but you can answer a few quick questions and get CME credit. With that said, I will let you guys all sign off. I think, Casey, you've got somewhere to be. John and I have to be just in bed because it's kind of late. And that's all I got.
So much fun.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank you for listening to the Addiction Medicine Journal Club. The best part of any journal club is the conversation, and we want to hear what you have to say. To have your thoughts included in a future episode, send us your comments on social media, email, or join our Facebook group. The links are in the show notes.
Original theme music was composed and performed by Benjamin Kennedy. Audio editing by Michael Bonanno. Produced by Dr. Patrick Beeman and Ars Longa Media. Addiction Medicine Journal Club is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. The views expressed here are our own and do not necessarily represent those of our employers or the authors of the articles we review. All patient information has been modified to protect their identities. Thank you for being part of the conversation. Have a great day.